Have you ever faced the giant of despair? I think if you're following Jesus, all of us have, to one degree or another. And today in our reading, man, Christian and hopeful, they get off the path for a smoother way and they fall into the grasp, I should say, of the giant of despair. And this, if you've never done this before, this can serve as a warning. But if you have faced the giant of despair, you'll be able to relate to this story today. So this is some good stuff to think about. And I will see you on the other side, and we'll discuss this some more here in just a moment.
Welcome to the Pilgrim's Progress in Modern English Daily Devotional. Join your host, David Yarbrough, and go with him through John Bunyan's timeless masterpiece, one devotional step at a time. Strengthen your faith, discover profound truths, and take another step closer to the celestial city. Let's get started.
Now I saw in my dream that they had not traveled far when the river and the road parted ways for a time. This made them quite sad, but they dared not stray from the path. The road away from the river was rough, and their feet were sore from their travels. Because of this, the pilgrims' spirits were greatly discouraged by the difficult road. Numbers chapter 21, verse 4. As they continued, they wished for an easier path. Soon, they came to a meadow on the left side of the road, with a stile leading into it. The meadow was called Bypath Meadow. Then Christian said to his companion, "If this meadow runs alongside our path, let's go into it." He went to the stile to check, and sure enough, a path ran parallel to the road on the other side of the fence. "This is just what I hoped for," said Christian. "Here is an easier path. Come on, good hopeful, let's cross over." Hopeful, "But what if this path leads us off the right way?" Christian, "That's unlikely," said Christian. "Look, doesn't it run alongside the road?" Hopeful, persuaded by his companion, followed him over the stile. When they crossed over and began walking on the path, they found it much easier on their feet. As they walked, they saw a man ahead of them on the same path. His name was Vain Confidence. They called out to him and asked where the path led. He replied, "To the celestial gate." "See," said Christian, "didn't I tell you so? Now you can see that we are on the right path." So they followed him, letting him lead the way. But soon night fell, and it became very dark. Those following could no longer see Vain Confidence ahead of them. Vain Confidence, not being able to see the path, fell into a deep pit. This pit had been deliberately placed there by the prince of the grounds to catch boastful fools, and he was crushed to death in his fall. Isaiah chapter 9, verse 16. Christian and Hopeful heard him fall and called out to ask what had happened, but there was no answer, only the sound of groaning. Then Hopeful asked, "Where are we now?" Christian remained silent, realizing that he might have led them off the right path. Then it began to rain, thunder, and lightning in a terrifying storm, and the water began to rise quickly. Hopeful groaned inwardly and said, "Oh, that I had stayed on the right path." Christian, "Who would have thought that this path would lead us astray?" Hopeful, "I was afraid of this from the start, and I gently warned you. I would have spoken more plainly, but you are older than I." Christian, "Good brother, please don't be angry. I am sorry for leading you off the right path and putting you in such danger. Please, my brother, forgive me. I didn't do it with bad intentions." Hopeful, "Be comforted, my brother, for I forgive you, and I believe this will work out for our good." Christian, "I am thankful to have such a merciful brother, but we must not stay here. Let's try to go back." Hopeful, "But let me go ahead of you, good brother." Christian, "No, if you don't mind, let me go first so that if there is any danger, I will face it first, since it was my decision that caused us both to go off the right path." Hopeful, "No," said Hopeful, "you shall not go first, for your troubled mind may cause you to lose the way again." Then to encourage them, they heard a voice saying, Set your heart toward the highway, the way you have traveled. Turn back again. Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 21. But by this time, the waters had risen greatly, making it very dangerous to return. I realized then that it is easier to stray off the right path than it is to get back on it. Nevertheless, they decided to try to go back. However, it was so dark and the flood was so high that in their attempts to return, they nearly drowned 9 or 10 times. Despite all their effort and skill, they could not make it back to the stile that night. Finally, they found a little shelter and sat down there until morning. Exhausted, they fell asleep. Not far from where they lay was a castle called Doubting Castle, owned by Giant Despair. The land they were sleeping on belonged to him. Early in the morning, Giant Despair went for a walk in his fields and found Christian and Hopeful asleep on his property. With a grim and harsh voice, he woke them up and asked where they were from and what they were doing on his land. They told him they were pilgrims who had lost their way. The giant said, "You have trespassed on my land by walking on it and sleeping here. Therefore, you must come with me." Since he was much stronger than they were, they had no choice but to follow him. They also said very little because they knew they were at fault. Giant Despair drove them before him and locked them in his castle in a dark, filthy dungeon that was so foul it depressed their spirits. Here they lay from Wednesday morning until Saturday night without a bite of bread, a drop of water, any light, or anyone to ask how they were doing. They were in a terrible state, far from friends and loved ones. Psalm chapter 88, verse 18. Christian's sorrow was doubled because he realized it was his unwise decision that had led them into this distress. Now, Giant Despair had a wife named Diffidence. When he went to bed, he told her what he had done, that he had captured 2 trespassers and thrown them into the dungeon. He asked her what she thought he should do with them. She asked who they were, where they came from, and where they were going, and he told her. She advised him that when he got up in the morning, he should beat them without mercy. The next morning, he took a heavy, rough club made from a crab tree and went down into the dungeon. There, he began yelling at them as though they were dogs, even though they had not said anything to offend him. Then he began to beat them severely, so much so that they couldn't defend themselves or even move on the floor. When he was finished, he left them to suffer in their misery, spending the entire day in nothing but sighs and bitter lamentations. The next night, Diffidence spoke further with her husband about them. When she learned they were still alive, she advised him to encourage them to end their own lives. The following morning, he went to them in the same gruff manner as before. Seeing how badly they were suffering from the beating he had given them the previous day, he told them that since they were unlikely to ever leave that place, they should take their own lives using a knife, a rope, or poison. "Why would you choose to live," he said, "when your life is filled with so much suffering?" But they begged him to let them go. At this, he looked at them with a terrifying expression and rushed at them. He would surely have killed them himself, but he suddenly, into one of his fits, for he sometimes fell into fits during sunny weather and temporarily lost the use of his hands. Because of this, he withdrew and left them, as before, to consider what they should do. Then the prisoners began to discuss whether it would be best to follow his advice or not, and the conversation went as follows. "Christian, brother," said Christian, "what shall we do? The life we are living now is miserable. For my part, I do not know whether it is better to continue living like this or to die at once. My soul prefers strangling over life, and the grave would be easier for me than this dungeon. Job chapter 7, verse 15. Should we follow the giant's advice? You know, the interesting thing about this story is that Hopeful and Christian had repented, and they were on their way back to the right path when it got dark and they fell asleep. And then when they woke up, man, there was the giant of despair that got them, and man, they got beat. And that's what despair will do. Man, it will beat us mercilessly. Depression, despair, all that. The world, the flesh, the devil is all against us. It is merciless when it's got us in their grasp. So the thing about this is very interesting to me is that although they had repented, they still had to suffer the consequences for their decision. So just because we repent doesn't mean we're always going to be relieved of the consequences of our choices. Many times we can be forgiven. Many times we can eventually make it back to the right path once again. But many times we have to suffer the consequences for our decisions, because it's there that we learn, man, I'm never going to get off this path again. I have suffered too greatly as a result in the past of getting off. So now I've learned my lesson. I will, at all costs, man, when I see an easier, smoother way to the side, I realize that easier, smoother path or meadow, it has got danger lurking out there. And the safest place for me is to stay right here, seeking first the kingdom of God, living under the kingdom, authority, rule of my King Jesus. Because then everything comes into my life. It's first got passed through his hands. And I know this, that if it passes through his hands, it comes with great meaning and eternal purpose in my life. So I have nothing to fear, nothing to worry about, because he is guarding and watching over me. Still bad things happen, yes, but he's still going to protect, he's still going to provide, and he's still going to see us through this.